Your nervous system can flood your body with shame, fear, and the physical sense of being small and in danger, and leave you no memory, no image, no explanation for why, no scene, no story, just the feeling, arriving fully formed, with nothing to point to. And because there is no image, you don't recognize it as a flashback. You recognize it as the present moment. You scan your current life for a cause, your relationship, your career, your sense of worth, and at your brain, which insists on reasons, finds something. Decisions get made from inside that wave. Conclusions get drawn about who you are and what you deserve, from inside a feeling that belongs to a child. Take a slow breath. You can let your shoulders settle. This is called an emotional flashback. It is one of the defining features of complex PTSD, a condition that went without formal diagnostic recognition for 26 years after it was first proposed. And the reason it went unrecognized in the literature for that long is the same reason it goes unrecognized inside the person experiencing it. There is no image to point to, nothing to say. That is what this is. There is a finding I want to hold until the second half of this. Something clinicians documented about what happens when people first hear the words emotional flashback applied to their own experience. The response was so consistent and so immediate that it changed how some researchers think about the work of healing itself. But first, you need to understand what was being missed and how long it was missed for. 26 years. If you grew up in a home where the danger was not a single event, but an atmosphere, where nothing specific happened that you could point to, but where you learned early to read the room before entering it, the traditional understanding of trauma had no name for what you were carrying. For most of the 20th century, trauma was understood through a single model. Something happened. A discrete event. A car accident. A combat exposure. An assault. The aftermath of that event produced identifiable symptoms. Nightmares, intrusive memories, hypervigilance, the sense of reliving something that had already occurred. This framework was formalized in 1980, when post-traumatic stress disorder was added to the DSM-3, following decades of advocacy by Vietnam veterans and the women's rights movement. That recognition mattered enormously. For the first time, an externally caused mental health condition received formal acknowledgement. The idea that what happens to you can wound you in lasting, measurable ways. But the model was built around a specific kind of trauma. A single event. A definable before and after. A thing you could point to. If your threat was a climate rather than a moment, if you lived inside prolonged, repeated emotional danger rather than a single identifiable event, the framework struggled to contain what you were carrying. You could arrive at a clinician with PTSD symptoms and something more. A corrosive, persistent shame, a fractured sense of self, deep disruptions in your capacity for relationship. And the field, often without intending to, did something that would cost people years. It attributed what was a trauma response to character. Emotionally unstable, personality disordered, too sensitive, difficult. The suffering was documented and observable, and it was consistently located in who you were, rather than in what had been done to you. This is the quiet error at the center of the story, and it lasted a long time. But someone was watching, and she was about to name what was actually happening. Before the framework, notice what this might mean for you. If any version of yourself has been told, by a clinician, a partner, a family member, or the quiet voice that runs inside your own mind, that the intensity of your reactions was the problem, that you needed to manage better, regulate better, simply be less of whatever you were too much of, what follows is where that story starts to crack open. In 1992, a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School named Judith Lewis Herman published Trauma and Recovery. Herman had spent years working with survivors of domestic violence. childhood sexual abuse, and prolonged interpersonal trauma. What she observed could not be explained by the existing PTSD framework. These patients carried the core PTSD symptoms, and something more pervasive: disturbances in self-concept, deep disruptions in the capacity for relationship, a shame that wasn't a symptom so much as a climate they had always lived inside. Herman proposed a new diagnosis: complex post-traumatic stress disorder. She argued, carefully and empirically, that trauma which is prolonged, repeated, and from which escape is difficult or impossible, the trauma of childhood, of captivity, of intimate partner violence, produces a syndrome meaningfully distinct from single incident PTSD. Not more dramatic, just different in its architecture, and requiring a different approach to heal. Here is where the anger is not only understandable, but accurate. In 1994, the proposal to include complex PTSD in the DSM-IV was rejected. Insufficient evidence. In 2013, with the DSM-V under revision, the argument was made again, with decades of accumulated research behind it. Reviewed, considered, rejected again. It would take until 2018, 26 years after Herman first named what she was seeing, for the World Health Organization to formally recognize complex PTSD in the 11th revision of the International Classification of Diseases, ICD-11. Defined by core PTSD symptoms plus 3 additional domains: persistent difficulty regulating emotion, a persistently negative self-concept, and significant disturbances in relationship. 26 years during which people carrying this condition were given other diagnoses that address the surface but not the source. We're told, in 100 indirect ways, that the problem was them. The field eventually caught up. And somewhere inside that gap, in the years between Herman's proposal and its recognition, a therapist in California named Pete Walker was drawing on his own experience of healing from complex trauma and beginning to map something the diagnostic literature still hadn't named. The emotional flashback was about to have a name. What that name would do to the people who finally heard it applied to themselves is the most important part of this story. You have experienced this, or you would not still be listening. The wave that arrives without warning, the sudden contraction, smallness, shame, despair, with no present-day cause you can clearly identify. The feeling that seems completely disproportionate to whatever just happened, but that arrives with such physical certainty that you find yourself treating it as information about your current life. Here is what is actually happening. Ordinary memory is organized in time. When you remember something, that memory carries a timestamp and a context. This happened then, there, to a younger version of me. The experience has been processed by the hippocampus, the brain structure that acts as archivist, sorting experiences into narrative sequences and placing them in the past. But when an experience is overwhelming, when the intensity of fear or shame or helplessness exceeds what the nervous system can process in the moment, the hippocampus doesn't complete that work. The experience isn't encoded as a narrative with a beginning and an end. It is encoded as sensation, body state, emotion without context, emotion without a timestamp, which means it has no past tense. When something in the present activates that encoded material, a tone of voice, a particular quality of silence, the slight shift in someone's expression, your amygdala fires as if the original danger is happening now. The body floods with the neurochemistry of survival, cortisol, adrenaline, the full activation of the threat response, and then something else happens, something that explains why you can't simply think your way through it. Neuroimaging research conducted by J. Douglas Bremner and colleagues at Yale and Emory, and separately by Scott Rauch and colleagues at Massachusetts General Hospital, found that during states of intense emotional flooding in trauma survivors, activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for reasoning, perspective taking, and observing your own emotional state decreases substantially. Activity in Broca's area, the region most closely associated with putting experience into words, can go significantly offline. You cannot narrate your way out of a flashback because the narrative generating part of your brain is not fully available to you while you are in one. Not broken. Overwhelmed. These are not the same thing. And because your reasoning brain is offline, your mind still demands a reason for what you're feeling. It is a meaning-making machine. It will search your present life, your relationship, your career, your sense of self, and it will find evidence for whatever the emotional state is already broadcasting. If the feeling says, "I am not safe here," your brain will locate proof that you're right. If it says, "I am fundamentally unworthy," your brain will find confirmation. Decisions get made. Conclusions get drawn. Relationships end. From inside a feeling that belongs to a child who no longer exists in a house that no longer exists. Pete Walker's most enduring contribution to complex trauma is not his description of emotional flashbacks. It is his map of the shapes that survival takes, and the way those shapes follow you into adult life wearing the clothes of personality traits. The 4F responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn describe the survival orientations that children adopt under conditions of chronic danger or relational neglect. The first two were originally identified by physiologist Walter Cannon in the 1920s. Freeze was later understood as the nervous system's most primitive retreat, a dissociative shutdown when fight and flight have both failed. Walker's specific contribution was the fourth, fawn, a pattern so prevalent among survivors of complex childhood trauma and so thoroughly unexamined in the clinical literature that its absence had been a conspicuous gap. The premise: in a home where danger is chronic and unpredictable, you don't simply endure the environment. You adapt to it. You develop a particular strategy, a specific configuration of self-management that earns you the most safety available. And that strategy becomes the lens through which you navigate every relationship, every conflict, every moment of vulnerability in the decades that follow. Unless you learn to recognize it for what it is. Fight. If you are a fight type, you learned that power could create safety, that enough assertion, enough control, enough preemptive intensity could keep danger at bay. In adulthood, this can look like explosive reactivity, difficulty tolerating others' autonomy, rapid escalation when a relationship begins to feel threatening. Underneath the intensity is almost always the same fear driving all four responses. I will be left. I will be abandoned. I will not be cared for. The anger is not the problem. It is armor over the problem. Flight. If you are a flight type, you learned that achievement could purchase safety, that staying in motion, producing, perfecting, might suspend judgment long enough to feel secure. In adulthood, workaholism, perfectionism, a constant low-grade anxiety converted into productivity. The stillness isn't available to you. Stopping feels like falling. Other people describe you as driven and impressive. You are often running from something you have never been able to name. Freeze. If you are a freeze type, you learned that disappearing was safest, that the least noticed child was the least hurt child. Walker describes this type as often the most profoundly abandoned, the child for whom fight, flight, and fawn had already been tried and failed, leaving only withdrawal. In adulthood, profound difficulty initiating, a gravitational pull towards solitude, a deep ambivalence about human connection. You may have built a rich inner world, in books, in imagination, in creative solitude, because that was where you first learned it was safe to be fully present. Fawn. Walker coined this term to describe the survival strategy of becoming maximally useful, agreeable, and attuned to the needs of the person who might otherwise harm you. reading the room before entering it, having the right response prepared before anyone can find fault with the real one. If this is your response type, you became the T, peacekeeper, the emotional caretaker, the one who never asked for too much and always gave more than was requested. Here's the part that took the longest to name. The qualities you developed under those conditions are frequently praised by the world. Warmth, generosity, attentiveness, the ability to intuit what others need before they say it. You may genuinely believe these are simply who you are, that you are, at your core, someone who prefers harmony and finds meaning in caring for others. What may not have been told to you yet is that this orientation was not freely chosen. It was built under conditions of fear as the price of safety. Walker writes that fawn types act as if they unconsciously believe the price of admission to any relationship is the forfeiture of all their needs, rights, preferences, and boundaries. When that structure is challenged, when a relationship requires you to actually be known, when ordinary closeness pushes against the armor, you feel something that seems completely disproportionate to the moment. A wave of fear, a flood of shame, a desperate impulse to disappear. You are in a flashback. But here's what most people experiencing this have never been told. Most emotional flashbacks are never recognized as flashbacks at all. Rest here. Let that settle. Take a slow breath. In a typical PTSD flashback, there is an image, a sound, a visceral reliving of something specific. The experience is tethered to a memory, however painful. There is at least the rough possibility of identification. This is fear from that. In an emotional flashback, there is nothing to point at. The feeling arrives fully formed. The shame, the despair, the terror, the smallness, with no accompanying scene and no story. And so, you do what any mind does. You search your present life for a cause. Your flooded brain finds evidence for what it is already feeling. The conclusion seems obvious, and it is wrong. You are not responding to your relationship. You are not responding to your career. You are responding to something encoded in your nervous system without a timestamp. Something waiting for a present-day trigger close enough to the original environment to activate it. What Walker documented consistently across his clinical work was what happened when survivors first heard the concept of the emotional flashback explained. The response was rarely relief, not immediately. It was recognition. A kind of stunned, tearful acknowledgement. That is what this is. The years of interpreting themselves as unstable, oversensitive, fundamentally broken, placed suddenly in a completely different frame. Not a character defect. A trauma response with a name. Walker found that the psychoeducation alone, simply learning the concept, simply hearing the words, produced immediate, measurable relief in clients. The knowing created a small but structural gap between the experience and the Moshvit's interpretation of the experience. In that gap, healing becomes possible. You need to understand what the flashback costs, not only in the moments it floods you, but in what happens in the seconds and hours that follow. After the wave, a voice arrives. Walker called it the inner critic, the internalized voice that takes the fear of the flashback and converts it into shame. This is not metaphor. It is a specific, observable psychological process with direct roots in how you were raised. When you grew up in an environment where certain emotions were dangerous, where anger was punished, where sadness was dismissed, where need was treated as burden, you learned, with the efficiency that survival demands, to punish yourself for those emotions before anyone else could. The inner critic is that self-punishment, automated and internalized. It does the caregiver's work from the inside. During a flashback, the critic arrives alongside the fear and converts it into something that feels like truth rather than reaction. The feeling becomes evidence. I am defective. I am too much. I am unworthy of love. The despair doesn't feel like a wave that arrived without cause. It feels like proof of something permanent and essential about who you are. This is the architecture of the flashback's self-reinforcement. The feeling arrives. The critic amplifies it into identity. The identity's shame deepens the original feeling. The cycle accelerates. And none of it, from inside, feels like the past. Here is the finding that reaches furthest into the quiet, ordinary lives of people who have never thought of themselves as trauma survivors. Complex PTSD, with its emotional flashbacks, its inner critic, its survival responses, can develop from emotional neglect alone. Not abuse, not violence, not anything identifiable as cruelty. Just the chronic, repeated experience of having a caregiver who was physically present but emotionally unavailable. A parent who could not attune. Who was critical in a diffuse, ambient way that never quite solidified into anything you could point to. Who was simply absent inside themselves, going through the motions, providing the basics, missing the child in the room. You didn't experience events you could later describe as traumatic. You experienced a climate, a relentless, low-grade sense of being unseen, unmet, somehow not quite enough. And your nervous system, calibrating itself in those years based on the relational environment around it, oriented itself to that climate as if it were the truth about the world. Not a dramatic origin story, just the slow erosion of a child who needed more than they received. You may not have a single event to point to. You may not think of yourself as a trauma survivor. You may only know that you have always felt, at some level, like too much and not enough simultaneously, and that you have never quite understood why. That is the cost, and it is real. And it is also not the end of the story. The inner critic is not a character flaw. This is worth pausing on, because it runs counter to how most people experience it. The inner critic is a learned survival function. It is the internalized voice of whoever taught you that certain emotional states were dangerous. Automated, running in the background, doing the punishment preemptively so you could stay safe. In its origins, it was adaptive. It served a real purpose. What it becomes, in adulthood, is a mechanism of self-abandonment. One that turns every flashback into confirmation of the worst beliefs you carry about yourself. The path through, and Walker is explicit on this, drawing from both his clinical work and his own healing, is not the suppression of the inner critic, not tougher willpower or more disciplined cognition. The path is grief, what Walker calls grieving the childhood abandonment, the work of acknowledging, not just intellectually but emotionally, what was actually lost. The need for safety that was not met. The need to be seen that was not met. The need to exist as a child, with ordinary needs and ordinary feelings, without having to manage the emotional reality of the adults around you. This is not self-pity. It is metabolization. Walker describes it as the irreplaceable tool for processing the emotional energy that fuels flashbacks. The understanding that the feelings that arrive are not random or disproportionate. They are appropriate reactions to real losses. They were real once. They simply have no way of knowing that the danger is over. As you learn to recognize emotional flashbacks in the moment, to say, as Walker suggests, simply, I am having a flashback. This is not the present. This is old. And to assign the feeling to its actual source rather than to a verdict on your current life, something shifts. The flashbacks become less frequent, less intense, shorter in duration. Your nervous system begins to learn what it was never taught, that the danger is not now. Research supports approaches that work with the nervous system directly. Somatic therapies address the physical traces of trauma where they live, in the held tension, the patterns of bracing, the body's learned vigilance. EMDR has shown significant effectiveness with complex trauma, working at the level of memory encoding to help traumatic material be processed and filed into the past rather than remaining perpetually present. Trauma-informed relational therapy offers something the techniques alone cannot: a corrective relational experience. The brain that first learned danger in relationship can relearn in relationship in a space that is consistent, attuned, and safe. Here is what I want to bring back to you directly before we reach the end. Before the frameworks and the clinical language, Walker writes that the feelings that arrive in an emotional flashback are not disproportionate. They are appropriate, but delayed. Let that settle for a moment. The grief, the fear, the shame, they belong somewhere real. They were real once. There was a version of you who needed more than was given, and those feelings are the residue of that unmet need. They have been waiting without a timestamp for a place to finally land. They can land now. They can be felt and named, and gradually, with time and support, released. And perhaps the most important shift in healing from complex PTSD is not the decrease in flashback frequency or the quieting of the inner critic. It is something quieter than both. The pain that once felt like evidence of brokenness begins to feel like something else. Not damage, history. And history can be placed gently in the past, where it belongs. Recovery is not linear. Walker is clear on this. There will be flashbacks again. The nervous system does not heal in a straight line. But with time, recognition, and support, the flashbacks become more identifiable. The inner critic becomes less convincing. The gap between the wave arriving and the wave passing grows a little wider. That gap is not nothing. That gap is everything. You can be sitting at a dinner table surrounded by people who love you. Someone laughs too loudly across the room. Something flickers. The old contraction, the pulling inward, the edge of that cold certainty. And something is different. You feel it arrive, and you recognize it. You put one hand to your sternum, quietly, where no one can see. You think, in a small and matter-of-fact interior voice, that's old. That feeling belongs to a much younger version of you, in a house that no longer exists. It doesn't belong here, in this present, in this life. You don't disappear. You don't spiral. You don't draw a conclusion about your worth from inside the wave. You stay. Not because the feeling has gone. It hasn't gone. But because you can feel it and know what it is. A signal from a younger self who learned very early that certain sounds meant danger was coming. A message that, once understood, no longer needs to be obeyed. This is what healing from emotional flashbacks looks like. Not the absence of the feeling, the capacity to recognize it and stay. If what you heard tonight has landed somewhere familiar, in your own experience, or in someone you love, I hope it offers something useful. Not a cure and not a promise. Just a name for something that may have gone unnamed for a long time. If this felt valuable, a like or a comment helps this work find the people who most need it. Let your breath come slow now. Let your body settle into where it is. The room around you is safe and quiet and still. Your nervous system learned danger, and it can learn this too.